So we've talked about how we vote according to our worldview. I want to go back to that idea because it's really important and it's really where we're going to spend most of our time. We use this analogy of a map. And one of the interesting things about maps are that they have resolution. So you have a map of the world, but then you have to decide what country it's a map of. Let's say you pick the United States. Then you have to pick what state. Then you have to pick what city. That's what I mean by resolution. There's a sort of a descent through the map, okay? So asking about a specific political issue, like should there be higher or lower taxes, for example, that's like asking where someone's house is on the map. You have to descend all the way through all that stuff. Are you talking about a house in Nigeria? Are you talking about a house in Sweden? Are you talking about a house in Indiana? You have to get through all those layers of the map. So we're going to talk about the sort of there are two big, really different worlds of maps. And those two have broken down into those two political parties. I mentioned that I think there's some reason why in the United States it's shook out into the Democrats and the Republicans. These really two primary political parties. And I think that's because in the United States, we really have two battling worldviews, two big maps through which people view the world. And generally, you fall into one or the other map. I believe that one of these maps is more biblical than the other. And I'm going to try and make a case. First, we're going to go through each of the maps. And again, these maps, it's like different worlds. I mean, it's like, do you have a map of the moon or do you have a map of the United States? They are completely different. And I think that's important because sometimes when we think about politics, we can think to ourselves, there's really no difference, or why are these two political parties always going at it? And the reason is because, however you want to say it, deep down or way up high, they have these different maps which are in conflict. So the liberal map is made up of 4 principles. The first principle, all men, just means men in the mankind sense of the word. All men, all people are perfectly free and equal by nature. 2, political obligation arises from the consent of the free individual. 3, government exists due to the consent of a large number of individuals, and its only legitimate purpose is to enable those individuals to make use of the freedom that is theirs by nature. Some of these are a mouthful, don't worry. Number 4, these premises are universally valid truths, which every individual can derive on his or her own if he or she only chooses to do so by reasoning about these matters. Now, I mentioned earlier, Thomas Jefferson would be the founding father who would align with the Democrat or the liberal worldview map. And he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And you can see at least two of these 4 liberal principles in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." That is the first and the fourth of the liberal worldview principles. Are these truths self-evident? He's just saying all you have to do is think about this and you'll come to the conclusion that all men are created equal, said the guy who owned slaves. So that doesn't make any sense. And then, just think about the fact that all men are created equal. Well, you have to define equal, right? I mean, Shaquille O'Neal was bigger as a baby than I was as a baby, so we aren't equal. Some people are born smarter than other people. Some people are born stronger. Some babies are born addicted to the drugs that their mothers are addicted to. You have to define equal. Second of all, he uses the word created, right? Created equal. Well, nowadays, someone who would believe in evolution would say, well, me just sitting down and thinking about it, I don't even believe men are created, much less created equal. So it really just falls apart, if you ask me. Principle number 2 is confused by the first word there, political. If you remove that word, suddenly it makes sense. Obligation arises from the consent of the free individual. So, what obligations do you have? That's essentially the question. And the worldview of liberalism says, well, you only have the obligations to which you consent to have, right? So you get married. At the moment you get married, you have consented to that marital relationship. But let's say 10 years go by, you are profoundly unhappy, you withdraw your consent, and the marriage is over. That's all it takes. No fault divorce, right? No fault divorce was came about as a result of communism, which we'll talk about later. But the point is that in the liberal worldview, in the liberal map, the only consent that you have is that which, or the only obligation you have is that to which you consent. If you don't consent to something, no obligation, right? So the United States of America, the nation that, kept generations of your family in relative health and relative safety such that you were able to be born, now is under threat, and there is a draft. Well, if you don't consent, then you can burn your draft card, and you can burn the flag, and you can burn the whole system down because you never consented to any of this stuff, right? That's the liberal worldview. In fact, not only are you only obligated to that which you consent, but if that is true, then any system which is attempting to put obligations on you that you did not consent to, you should work to destroy. And you should work to enact a system to which you do consent, right? There is a titchy bit of truth in this, though, isn't there? I mean, think about the founding of the country. What was happening is the colonists were being taxed and having other laws placed upon them to which they did not consent. But deeper than that, to which they did not have any representation, right? There was that was the whole deal. No taxation without representation. That was everything they were fighting about. Okay, but it's not entirely wrong. There's a grain, a kernel there. And then principle number 3 is related to the second one, that government only exists because people consent to its existence. And so it's kind of like the fairies at the end of Peter Pan, say you believe in fairies because Tinkerbell is dying, and you clap if you believe in fairies, and everybody's clapping and crying, and it's wonderful, and the idea is that if you stop believing in fairies, the fairies will die. And that's sort of the liberal view of the government. If you stop believing in the government, if you just withdraw your consent, then kind of magically, poof, it just ceases to be. If you withdraw your consent from your marriage, then just poof, your marriage is gone. If you as a rebellious teenager just withdraw the consent from your parents, then poof, your obligation to do what they tell you just vanishes. It's just gone. The idea of liberalism can really be summarized, the whole map can sort of be summarized in a single word, and that word is rationalism. Rationalism is the philosophy that reason alone can guide us to a better blank. So our reason alone can guide us to a better government, to a better marriage, to a better church, to a better whatever it is. You can fill in that blank. Okay, all we have to do, right, the fourth principle, all we have to do is reason about these matters, whatever those matters are. So that's the liberal map. Next, we get to the conservative map, which aligns generally, neither of these are perfect, right, but aligns generally with the Republican Party positions. And it is made up of 6 principles. The first principle is people are born into families, tribes, and nations to which they are bound by ties of mutual loyalty. Second, individuals, families, tribes, and nations compete for honor, importance, and influence until a threat or a common endeavor recalls them to the mutual loyalties that bind them together. Number 3, families, tribes, and nations are hierarchically structured, their members having importance and influence to the degree they are honored within the hierarchy. Number 4, language, religion, law, and the forms of government and economic activity are traditional institutions developed by families, tribes, and nations as they seek to strengthen their material prosperity, internal integrity, and cultural inheritance, and to propagate themselves through time. Just like the liberal map, this is a lot. We'll talk about it. Number 5, political obligation is a consequence of membership in families, tribes, and nations. Finally, these premises are derived from experience, and they can be challenged and improved upon in light of experience. The map of conservatism can be summarized in a single word, and that word is empiricism. The philosophy that experience, and not just my experience, but the experience of all of humanity through all of recorded history, encapsulated in the form of language, religion, tradition, law, forms of government, etc. That experience, all of it, can be a guide to a better blank, to a better government, to a better church, to a better marriage. I don't look to my reason. I instead look to experience of humanity through time. Can you see that these two things are different worlds? Like they are not adjacent, right? They are far apart. There is a vast gulf between the liberal map and the conservative map. Which aligns with the Bible? All right, liberal principle number 1. Depends on your definition of equal, right? If your definition of equal is that every human being, male and female, regardless of size, regardless of intelligence, regardless of wealth, regardless of bodily deformities, regardless of any of that stuff, every single human being is made in God's image. That's Genesis. We see it right there in the beginning. If that's the definition of equality, then right on. But if equality means something else, then no. I mean, people aren't born perfectly free. No. Perfectly equal, rather. Second one, perfectly free. Are you born without any obligations, right? Are you only obliged to that which you consent? No. I mean, take a look at the 10 Commandments. The fourth one, honor your father and mother so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So, bam, you are born and you are obligated. You didn't consent to being born, but the Bible says you're born, you honor your mother and your father. Boom, right there. That's it. Not only that, but talking about ancient Israel, inside that system in which the 10 Commandments was given, sometimes your very profession you would be obligated to it by virtue of your birth. If you were born into the tribe of Levi, then whether you consented to it or not, you were a member of the priesthood. That was it. You didn't get to choose. You didn't get to consent to the priesthood. Biblically, the instant you are born, you are obligated to things. And this idea of consent, I mean, that you're only obligated to that which you consent. Also know, biblically, right? God commanded the stoning of disobedient children. So you're rather obligated to your parents biblically, whether you would like to be or not. And Paul commanded people in the New Testament, commanded followers of Christ, to submit to their government. They didn't decide to be born, in the Roman Empire under all of that tyranny, but Paul said to them, let everyone submit to the governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. So then, the one who resists the authority is opposing God's commands, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. So, biblically, we are in fact born into families, tribes, and nations to which we are bound by ties of mutual loyalty. And political obligation is biblically a consequence of membership in those tribes. You are born, you are obligated at the instant of that birth, biblically. This third liberal principle, that government only exists because of consent. Again, going back to the Apostle Paul in Romans 13, he writes, the authorities that exist are instituted by God. So government doesn't exist because people consent to it. Governments exist because God permits them or even institutes them. Inside of that liberal principle number 3, the idea that the only purpose of government is to ensure freedom. Romans 13. Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be unafraid of the one in authority? Do what is good, and you will have its approval. For the government is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because the government does not carry the sword for no reason. So, God says that at least one additional purpose of the government is to enforce its own laws. So much of the Old Testament is God telling the people of the government of Israel what it is responsible for. And it was a lot more than ensuring freedom. So the only purpose of government is not to allow perfect freedom. Government is instituted by God, and it carries the sword, and so the government, therefore, has to define what it will carry the sword to and what it won't. And hopefully, those things will be good things. This liberal principle that these things are universally valid. Well, they aren't universally valid if they contradict the Bible. The liberal idea that every reasonable individual who considers these things will come to these conclusions, except Moses and Paul. So I think you can see going through there that the liberal map is biblically totally off the table. What about the conservative map? Paul and Moses both confirm principles number 1 and 5. We saw that. On principle number 4, we see God in the Old Testament giving the people of Israel religion, giving them law, giving them forms of government. Twice he gives them the original theocracy, and then he institutes the kingship later on. He talks much in the Old Testament about their system of economic activity and what that's to look like, which we'll talk about. And he even divvies them up into families, tribes, and nations. So that's principle number 3. Inside of conservative principle number 3, there's this idea of hierarchy. And the Bible is packed with hierarchy. A lot of people today really dislike this idea of hierarchy. Some even inside marriage itself dislike the idea of there being a hierarchy. But this is all over the Bible. First of all, you had the Levitical priests in ancient Israel. They were hierarchically, in a sense, above the ordinary Israelite citizen because they were the way in which that citizen connected to God. So you literally had to go to the priest for righteousness, right? That's certainly hierarchical. The kings of Israel, well, the very idea of a king is, in fact, hierarchical. In the Old Testament, you see Moses working, I think with his father-in-law, to set up men to be judges over certain numbers of citizens and to divvy things out. Hierarchy. In the New Testament, the church is to have elders who are shepherding the sheep. shepherds are over sheep. So hierarchy. I mentioned it a moment ago, but this idea of inside of marriage, wives are submit to husbands, and husbands are to submit to the Lord. There's hierarchy there. And you even astonishingly see hierarchy inside the Trinity, right? Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but your will. He did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. So Christ does the will of the Father. There is hierarchy inside the Trinity, which is amazing. So the idea of hierarchy is entirely biblical. The second principle, that everybody inside families, tribes, and nations sort of competes, jockeys for position, right, until an external threat enters into the realm, and then suddenly unity happens again. Biblical history bears this out. Think of the number of times in the nation of Israel in which it basically nearly dissolved, or in some cases was entirely conquered. And then what? Well, that oppression causes everybody to return to the Lord, to repent from everybody doing what was right in their own eyes. Unity, pursuing God, cycle repeats again. Our nation saw this in World War II, and to an extent in World War I. Divisions, right? Different political parties, everybody's jockeying for position, and then all of a sudden Pearl Harbor happens, and whammo, everyone is on the same page. All the nation's industries are churning. People are signing up. Women are entering the workforce to manufacture the materiel to prosecute the war against the Nazis and the other Axis powers, right? Total national unity all of a sudden. FDR gets elected 4 times, I think. Total unity there. You can even see it sometimes inside of families. Siblings are fighting, and then all of a sudden somebody gets hurt, and suddenly there's total unity. We got to go get mom and dad. They're not fighting anymore. They're on the same page to get help to the person who's been hurt. So that's that principle, that second principle there, confirmed biblically. Conservative principle number 4. I think we covered that one, didn't we? Yeah, that God commanded religion, law, economics, as God commanded the people of Israel to be priests to the nations. This 6th premise, that these things come from experience. Well, the Bible is human experience written down, literally going back to the first 2 people. So for all of those reasons, I think that the conservative map lines up biblically. And so as we vote, we should look for people and political parties which align with that map, which, even though I mentioned earlier, it's attached generally to the Republican Party, it may not always be. It may not be now, it may not be in 100 years, it may not be in 20 years. These things can change. Ronald Reagan, I mentioned he's renowned on both sides of the political aisle as one of the great Republican presidents. He began as a Democrat, and he quite famously, when he was confronted about that, because, politicians love to call each other on their flip-flops. And so he was called on the fact that he used to be a Democrat and was now a Republican, and his famous response was, he said, "I didn't leave the Democrat Party left me," right? In other words, things can change.